All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces out there in the crowd. Welcome to the third discussion in our four-part series on shipbuilding and addressing the Navy's most urgent maritime challenges. I want to give a special thanks to Mr. Steve Waters, who is a member of our Board of Trustees, for his sponsorship of this event. Always been very generous to us, so thank you, Mr. Waters. Today's focus is on how non-traditional defense firms and tech startups are transforming unmanned systems. And I'm sure we're also going to talk a little bit about alternatives to legacy acquisition processes. Many of you shared when we asked what you hope to learn from this discussion. So I think we're going to pop a slide up there, which is essentially the top 5. So thank you so much for all your inputs. And essentially it was how unmanned systems fit into the future hybrid fleet, how we make interoperability seamless, especially in contested environments, what specifically needs to be done to accelerate development and acquisition, where we are with shipbuilding capacity, manufacturing scalability, workforce challenges, and probably more importantly, what can be done about it. And then, certainly not least, but the timeline. What is actually achievable in the relatively near term? Fortunately, these priorities align very well with our panel's expertise. We've got leaders with operational experience spanning research, startups, innovation, industry, and unmanned systems, all focused on one critical question: how do we accelerate unmanned innovation to sustain maritime superiority? It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Mr. Michael Stewart, former director of the Navy's Disruptive Capabilities Office. He also served as executive director of the Navy's Unmanned Task Force and chaired both the NATO Tri-Service Main Armaments Group and NATO Naval Armaments Group. He's a retired Navy captain and naval aviator. He also worked in senior roles in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Navy's Office of Integrated Warfare. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and the Naval War College and holds an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Stewart. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, sir. So firstly, I'd like to thank Rear Admiral Spicer and the U.S. Naval Institute for putting us on. This is the third discussion in USNI's four-part series of the Navy, or addressing the Navy's most urgent maritime challenges. So I think your leadership in convening this is hugely important in bringing us together, so thank you. Now, before I start an interview or introduce all my panelists, I'd like to sort of frame the discussion. And this really comes from two things: talking to very recently leaders from the Ukrainian military and some of the things that are going on in the Navy. So first slide is this. When I was speaking to the Ukrainians, they said, just to give us a scale of what is going on, that their production of 10 million drones annually, daily they have strikes between 500 and 800 drones nightly, and with 215,000 strikes this summer. Now, why is that interesting to this audience? Well, if you're going into the Red Sea or a constrained battle space or a passage transit, that suddenly starts to become more interesting. Next slide. Of those strikes, what's going on, what they told us of the targets that are being destroyed in Ukraine, 80 to 85% of them are taken out by UAVs and eclipsing artillery, tanks, aircraft, and infantry. Again, why is this interesting to you? So I think one of the things you're learning in Ukraine is if you're in a weapons engagement zone or close to the front, you're going to get taken out fairly quickly. Exquisite assets do not persist. They told me, the Ukrainian general told me on average a tank lasts about 5 minutes, right? And so what's the lesson there for us to think about? Next slide. The second, or the other thing they highlighted to me was the pace of innovation. So if you think about their rate of innovation from 2022 to today and the number of cycles and the number of boats they've pumped out, it's actually it's impressive. I mean, having been at the UTF and the DCO, and the way you're seeing our struggles with some of the boats that we're struggling with, to see their pace of innovation is amazing. And if you go back to 2022, Ukraine has leveraged these drones, and they're equipped with cameras, satellite communications, warheads, navigation systems. They come with the redundant links, acoustic sensors, even R-73s or AIM-9 essentially to shift the balance. And then speed is the key. Interestingly, what the Ukrainians said to me was the technology is slightly interesting, but the ability to innovate is what's going to win battles. Next slide. I think we know this story, right? So their modularity has enabled diverse roles from kamikaze strikes to intercepting Su-30 fighters this year to ultimately expelling the Russian fleet, Black Sea fleet from the Western Black Sea and securing merchant access to Ukrainian ports. I don't know if you saw the other day that the Ukrainians struck a couple of Russian oil terminals trying to shut down their oil. And this, as they call it, long naval spear, has damaged or destroyed 21 vessels, 3 helicopters, 2 aircraft, the Crimean Bridge, and is serving both as a strike weapon and a deterrent. Next slide. So this is starting to align, or the Navy is starting to align to this thought process. If you think about the recent MASC, which is the Modular Attack Surface Craft solicitation, which is calling for a fast, high-capacity USV of carrying 1, 2, or more payloads, potentially over 2,500 nautical miles at 25 knots, with a focus on quick delivery of a prototype within 18 months, with the ability to scale rapidly. Essentially a minimum viable product of getting it out there. Next slide. Again, with the backdrop of 2 memos that recently came out, and one from the SecDef essentially saying, let's reform JSIDs, and the other one from the Secretary of the Navy talking about RAS, or Robotic Autonomous Systems memo, standing up POs, and a dozen. And so I think there's a recognition that, or a dozen, there's a recognition that we have to go faster. So think about that while I start introducing the guests. So I'm going to go from my immediate left down the row. Firstly, I have a friend of mine, Dr. John Phillips. He's an engineer serving as the Director of Fleet Engagement at NSWC Carderock, and has been supporting the Unmanned Task Force and the Navy Disruptive Capabilities Office for the past 4 years. He has experience supporting fleet commands, the Office of Naval Research, the Marine Corps, POUSC, SCO, and DIU as a government technical leader in the field of robotics and autonomous systems. Next, we have Ryland Hamilton. He's the CEO and founder of Blue Water Autonomy. He leads the development of unmanned maritime systems for defense and commercial applications, driving rapid prototyping and Navy partnerships. As a former surface warfare officer, his operational experience shapes his approach to autonomous capabilities. Next, we have Vice Admiral Michael Connor, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Thayer Mahan. He's a retired submariner with extensive undersea warfare experience. His leadership advances autonomous undersea networks to enhance fleet operation. And next we have Rome Ruiz, Head of Growth and Partnerships at Saab. He's a senior executive and a former Navy ship commanding officer, bridging traditional and innovative naval systems as a surface warfare officer, and leveraging operational insights to integrate unmanned technologies. And last but certainly not least is Greg Glaros, a retired naval aviator, a transformation strategist who was the founder and CEO of Synexus, where he has delivered disruptive innovation in platform integration, autonomy, and shipbuilding. A longtime advisor to Pentagon leadership, he co-authored the charters of the Office of Force Transformation, inputs to the new Navy's Rapid Capabilities Office, and the Maritime Shipbuilding Strategy. And he's been a relentless advocate for outcome-driven reform. So with that, I'm just going to go right down the list and ask specific questions, and then what we're going to do is open it up to a general question, and then we'll take audience questions from there. So, Dr. Phillips, what industry and government collaboration models have you seen implemented at Carderock and across the NRDE aimed at rapid fielding of USV capabilities, and what are the pros and cons of each of those models, and how may the new Department of War initiatives to include the RAS office and the JSIS changes help us go faster by balancing discipline with creative testing?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It started on a very positive note. I remember just 3 years ago, you and I working through how to ask for a couple $1 million for small USV proof of concept. And going from that to 1.5 billion of reconciliation funds, I think goes to show how far we've come in focusing on making these systems real. So with that, I think it's really important that we get it right? Because we have a lot of momentum right now. We don't want to kill the momentum. And to do that, I think we have to learn from the systems that are currently in development and that are working towards being fielded. I've seen 4 models be implemented to learn from in the USV space, primarily the smaller USVs. And the first is, in the early stages of an industry solution, you may have something that's about a 70% solution. But you get a lot of input from the fleet on saying they want it to do this mission or that mission. That's where the Warfare Center and industry partnership can come in. You can start by acquiring that 70% solution, add some capabilities like comm suites to give it better comms connectivity, or mission payloads for exactly what the fleet wants to accomplish. That's really good in the early stages when there's maybe not a solution that does everything for you that you can buy. As the industry helps to evolve, you may get something that's closer to a 95% solution, but oftentimes the government, the warfare centers like Carter-Rock need to come in and do some of that validation and verification testing to help frame the fleet as they build their ConOps and TTPs as to exactly what they're getting. And also just to add things like mission payloads that maybe aren't available to the average industry partner. The third is something that is, I think, extremely effective but is less talked about, and that's partnering up the warfighter, the industry partner, and the warfare center early, and building those first initial prototypes, and then giving that technical data package to an industry partner to go scale. That's not a COT solution necessarily, but it is a way to get there. And third, something that was very popular as you were working with Task Force 59 to stand up is the contractor-owned, contractor-operated model. I think what's key to that contractor-owned, contractor-operated model is how do you develop that data collection and analysis plan that's going to inform the decision makers to get past that model in the future. And so those are all models I think are important to learn from as we move out, and there's a place for all of them if we're going to move fast. And no matter what, we have to make sure that we're solving the problems and we're giving the fleet solutions that they actually want and that they can implement.
I agree, and I'll just make a quick comment because, again, talking to the Ukrainians, their message to me was, their ability to, you have an operational problem, you find somebody who thinks they've got a solution, essentially you throw them into the front. Somebody joked, if send Yuri to the front, if Yuri survives, buy more of Yuri's thing, right? But the idea that you're getting immediate feedback and then you can start iterating on it. So thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
Rylan? With your startup background and operational experience, what technical impediment will challenge the MASC initiative, and how can startups leverage the new RAS structures to overcome it while balancing disciplined execution with innovative testing?
Thanks. For context, our company focuses on USVs that operate across open oceans. So we think about the endurance, the range, and payloads for the Pacific. And I think one of the hard parts about that problem is the autonomy, and I'll unpack it a little bit. There are 3 parts to autonomy. There's navigation autonomy, there's engineering autonomy, and there's payload autonomy. I think there's a lot of work that's been done on navigation autonomy. And to kind of use SWO speak, think about a software agent that replaces the officer of the deck. They're doing the navigation, they're doing localization, they're doing obstacle detection. But engineering autonomy, that's replacing the engineering officer of the watch. And for vessels that have to operate for months at a time, that's a really hard problem. Today we have 50 sailors in some of our large ships, standing watch, maintaining and repairing ships while underway. The kind of baseline right now is about 720 hours. We've done some land-based testing, but we really need to push that to a couple thousand hours of testing. That's where we spend a lot of time. And then the third piece is, the payload autonomy, or replacing the sort of combat officer. But I think that middle piece, we need to spend more resources and solve that, because if we have vessels that are sort of stranded in the middle of the ocean, we have to send a really expensive utility ship out to kind of go either repair or tow it back into port, the fleet's going to fire us. And so that's a piece that we have to get the autonomy right, and all pieces need to work. But I think that middle piece is definitely where we need to spend some more time. You also mentioned some of the reforms that are happening right now. I think on the acquisition side, and we're sort of a newcomer to the space, we've actually been pleasantly surprised at the engagement we've had with the Navy. And I think the ethos of what we've seen from the Secretary of War is partner with industry. So we've seen the acquisition community be agile, move fast, iterate, and partner with industry. I think the next phase will also be adoption. It's one thing to acquire a vessel, to go build it. It's another to get fleet adoption and to work through all the little details that really matter. And so what I've seen on the commercial side, and I've been kind of warehouse automation, is that we'll deploy systems, whether it's for Amazon or other kind of large retailers, is they'll partner with you and they'll let you make retrofits either on the hardware side, they'll let you do software updates. I don't know if we necessarily have that model where if the Navy takes possession of a ship, can we do an upgrade the next day, and what does the paperwork look like? And so that's one of the next challenges that we'll have to work through.
Thank you for that. Quick question made me think of something. You mentioned the COCO model. Would the COCO model for a startup like that, would that be helpful, or yes or no?
The COCO model is definitely interesting. I think when you get into the medium size, there's a fair amount of capital that it takes to actually go construct these vessels. So I think there has to be some kind of balance between the Navy upfronting some money if they want a vessel that's like high performance, so it's not just a little utility ship that's out there. They're looking for, they have certain speed requirements and payload requirements, and so that makes it a little bit more expensive. And so for any kind of private company to back that fully gets a little bit difficult. But I do like the agility that comes when the contractor owns and operates a vessel and has the ability to kind of tweak and modify it a little bit to then give yourself a transition period from between maybe a COCO model and a time when the fleet would actually own the asset itself.
Sounds good. And I just noticed that you guys switched, so I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed. So I'll go to Admiral Connor. Drawing on your undersea warfare experience, what is needed to move inside the 2025 window for autonomous undersea networks, and what missions do you foresee in the contested environments?
So we make remote and autonomous systems mostly for acoustic sensing, and some of them are mobile, some of them are fixed, and we deploy them commercially and for the government. So I point that out because we learn a lot in the commercial world that could apply to the government. In the commercial world, they don't worry too much about your software build or your design spec. They worry about whether it works or not, and very much like the Ukrainians, and we have some experience there too. So if you want to move fast and you want to attract agile companies, tell them what you want them to do, hire them to do it, pay them if they do it successfully. And if they don't pay them. So that sort of gets back to your contractor-owned, contractor-operated idea. I think that's the fastest way for a couple of reasons. One is there's less risk of the government spending a lot of money on something that doesn't work. Let the private sector do that. The private sector will find the money if the target is big enough, if they succeed. And that way you can learn a lot more about how to go forward. Don't over-regulate people in a new industry using specifications that are derived from the way we always used to do things. And lastly, if you use one of these more flexible models, like contractor-owned, contractor-operated, let them use operating funds, so O&M funds in Navy speak. And that will give the fleet commanders more ability to flow money to the things that they want and like and that work.
So interesting you should say that, because again, I don't want to keep referencing the Ukrainians, but they're doing this fairly well. It's exactly what they said, is flow money to the operational commanders. They've got the problem, perhaps, set a cap on it. I don't think you're going to say, go build an aircraft carrier or something like that, but definitely give them the ability to go test and iterate on things really quickly. And don't centralize the control so much, really decentralize and empower people. So thank you. Rome. So leveraging your operational industry insights as a former cruiser skipper, how can the new RAS offices and JACES reforms streamline your collaboration with the Navy to accelerate deployment of integrated manned and unmanned platforms by 2030? And how do you view USVs in this context?
I think what I really enjoy, and particularly with this crowd and with some of my colleagues up here, is that we're looking at this from folks who've been under fire and now are under contract, right? So there's a really interesting perspective that I think is offered amongst all of us. From a priority standpoint, I look at what is the playbook for C2. C2, when I think about all these USVs, you're either looking at having to trust machines, whether it be through autonomy, machine learning. And I think that, or you've got to have resilient comms. And so I think that there needs to be a playbook with just no bespoke adapters here. There's so many folks that can work comms, and one of my frustrations as a CO was just all the different comms paths and all the requirements to keep different comms. And the ones that were most common, whether it was Link 16 or something like that, tended to be used the most and were most effective. I mentioned resilient comms as being a priority, just because having taken the America ARG MU team out to the Pacific and just exercising and experimenting out there, LPI and LPD comms, directional comms, mesh networks, those sort of things, in my view, are going to be the things that we're going to need for resilient comms. And I know we talk about having command at sea and being able to make decisions on our own, but I still think that in order to communicate with all the things that are going to be out there, you still got to have resilient comms, and whether that be through lasers or not. And then the other piece of it is just the continuous fleet experimentation. I think that what I've learned with fleet experimentation, whether it be through our innovation hub at Saab, is that, and this kind of goes back to what Rylan was saying, is if you're going to do software updates, how do you know, if you're going to do them often, how do you know that they're going to work in the environment that they're designed? And so you've got to go and experiment, at least in my mind, quarterly, those new updates. And if you fail, then as to what Mike said, is you're out, right? And you move on. But that way there is a constant rehearsal of that software is doing what that is designed to do. So those would be my things. As far as JSID's reform and question that you mentioned about the RAS, for me, there should be maybe portfolio requirements that should be leveraged across, things that are KPPs that are associated with, like, everybody needs to have the same target quality track data in a jamming environment, as an example, right? There's not a separate one for each platform. I think we should be publishing interfaces and data rights outright. Know what APIs to plug into. Know how to integrate, in weeks, not years. And then I think there needs to be standing integration cells and shared ranges. We need to be able to, and there are some shared ranges, but if you ask a lot of people where they're at, they might not even know. But I think ranges are a huge thing, because especially for people with effectors that need to go and test stuff. But and then finally, just spiral contracts that would be based on fleet results. So if you do well, then you keep going and you get on contract, because there's got to be some predictability with those.
Sounds good. So this morning, ironically, I was at another event, and the notion of ranges came up. And what industry said is it would be wonderful if perhaps there was an investment where you fully instrumented, maybe Port Hueneme, almost like an Edwards Air Force Base, if people can bring their stuff and just start testing their stuff and see if it works or not. And so, and you're iterating on it. But let me just go back to your background for a second. So you previously came from an AI company after your cruiser skipper world. You talked about resilient comms. Tell me about AI. What should we know with your background about USVs and AI?
Yeah, I think so Mike mentioned regulation. I think that if you start from the top and go down from a strategic standpoint, there's, and the congressional piece is weighed in heavily on how do you regulate AI. I think that, it should be more of the regulation of outcomes versus regulating the actual innovation. If they're worried about how AI is going to do, I think that it needs to look at what it's producing and then regulate it that way, in my opinion. Because at the moment you start kind of putting the brakes on the innovation and putting regulation on that stifles innovation. What I learned at Spark was, and how it kind of came together in industry itself, was that data is a huge piece of this. And if you have data and a lot of, then you need to partner up with folks that If you don't have data, you need to partner up with folks that do. I also think that when you start looking at the people that are building solutions, you need to think outside the defense industry. I had a number of folks that worked for me that solutionized that had never been in the military, but they worked in oil and gas, or they worked in other industries that use data in all kinds of different innovative ways because they're out there doing competitive intel and those sort of things. So I think that, don't close the doors on the folks that can provide some really interesting pieces. And then the other is that you've got to continue to trust or continue to experiment with it. It's that data is only going to be, those models are only going to be as good as you train them. And you've got to, if you're going to do edge processing, you've got to be able to train those models in a way that learn from that environment that's out there, and that's going to be a lot of reps and sets.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, certainly, if somebody had asked me 5 years ago, Mr. Stewart, is AI important? I would have said, oh, absolutely. And if they said why, I have no idea, but I know I'm supposed to say that. But now I think the Navy's now starting to understand specific use cases, why AI is important, why data collection is important, so all that. Greg, so you've led multiple disruptive initiatives from the Stiletto carbon fiber vessel to providing SpaceX its first rocket contract to chartering the Office of Force Transformation. What lessons from those experiences most influenced your thinking on the creation of the Rapid Capabilities Office and then the Requirements Resourcing and Acquisition Board, the Mission Engineering and Integration Activity, the Joint Acceleration Reserve, things that are coming out, framework? And why do you think so many previous reform efforts like Secretary Rumsfeld's 6-page FAR replacement or Deep Blue in the Strategic Studies Group ultimately failed to deliver lasting change?
Leadership matters. The vision that leads to organizational alignment, that provides the resources and the authority for those to make those decisions to build those systems. Stiletto is one example. The requirement came from, just as I think now this Requirements and Resource Alignment Board is seeking, which is the combatant commanders had a need, in this case SOCOM. Navy SEALs were getting beat up at such a rate that they were experiencing ejection seat-like shock every hour. By 10 years of operations, they were 100% medically disqualified. And you just wonder what the heck we were doing to our sailors. At the same time, we had no platform with which to conduct all these experimentation that folks wanted to participate in. So Stiletto was birthed for $25 million and produced in 15 months. That was unheard of at the time with a new novel material, which is the carbon fiber. And that was actually influenced by Saab in what they did with the VISB, and we took cues from them and support from them in conducting those operations. At the same time, what was missing from that platform, and most platforms, was a digital backbone. Everyone talked about plug and play, but no one generally understood how do you provide the environment with which others to bring their, as I would call, ornaments on this Christmas tree. And so what we did, and what we ended up designing in the company I founded, was adhering to industry standards. Cameras and sensors went NTSB, or HDMI. Radios require serial control and data bus. Some other cameras can be Ethernet if the environment isn't changing, such as an engine room. And so we complied with those and provided a means with which to host them on a distributed platform that allowed processing to occur discreetly. And that's what got rid of the latencies from that standpoint. On the action of SpaceX getting the first rocket, that was real risk. And the combatant commander for that was the Indo-Pacific. They could not track certain assets at sea because everyone knew with mathematical precision what our national sensors were providing. So we needed something to, within the operational time frame, is to deploy an asset on the highest altitude in LEO. But there was no means in our country of building a fast satellite, and even a worse capability of launching. It took $2 billion in 10 years to put anything on orbit. That was really absurd. So we built the first tactical satellite in 11 months. We looked around. We actually asked the Air Force if they'd be willing to take the retiring Minuteman rockets, take the warhead off, and put a satellite on it. Seemed to me pretty viable and made common sense. They were fearful that if they had a faulty launch, that all the math that they had produced to Congress for the risk aversion would collapse on itself and there'd be question. So that was nixed. So we went to this renegade who wanted to go to Mars. Had a small lab there in Palo Alto and was building a rocket. You know, he brought in the next generation of Germans for rocket propulsion, and his own genius and business savvy and the money that he raised with the small authority that was being provided from the Office of Force Transformation of $6 million for a contract at least gave him a toehold. And then DARPA led later on with additional money on the commercial side. The rest is its own history and his genius that went forward. So disruption often means to take the risk both in career as well as the financial risk, and it may end up displacing something else that's very crucial and sacred to the organization. And you certainly, having gone to Harvard Business School, and we had Clay Christensen in our office, he understood what sustaining innovation was and disruptive innovation. And those were very clear terms in understanding that, and we as a nation found that out on the steel industry, where we lost the capacity to manufacture steel because where I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, we gave away the rebar. Then we gave away plate steel. We said there isn't a margin enough for that. And then we said we're just going to make stainless steel and I-beams. Well, eventually the mini mills were satisfied with 1% margins, and they overcame this great Bethlehem Steel, of which the last big ship they built was the USS Saratoga, which was my first carrier. So you look at those kinds of context of disruption and what is occurring certainly in Ukraine. Is that now overlearning what Ukraine is doing and we can apply that to the Pacific? There's still the tyranny of distance. There's still the necessity for support and sustainment of those assets out there and the sheer numbers. Bureaucratically where we are today, hopefully in the next 24 hours, Mr. Hung Kao will be confirmed as Undersecretary. His journey to being Undersecretary started with a meeting with the President on November 25th of last year. So in that period of time, China has built the size of the French Navy. And the time it takes for us to provide the supporting individuals for the current Secretary of the Navy, who's underwater with learning a new organization as well as the big changes that are coming, does not have an Undersecretary, does not have an ASN RDNA, does not have the individuals necessary to lead change. So that's what disruption takes. It takes that courage and the leadership to make the decisions. And I know that the Secretary of the War, Mr. Hegseth, has put into place, which we all know from the memos you set up there, is the Requirements and Resource Alignment Board, RRAB. Okay, it doesn't sing like JSIDS, all right? We've gotten rid of that process, but now we're replacing it with also a mission engagement integration activity and the joint acceleration resource. That new combined effort actually is a large-scale designed effort that simulates what we did at the very small scale at Force Transformation, yet it gives the leadership, the authority, the capability, and the courage to bring about massive change. Does that lead to a more affordable and faster delivery carrier? I hope so. Does it lead to these new medium unmanned surface vessels? I hoped by the hundreds, through the procurement from several companies. And also as well as corvettes and destroyers and frigates that need to come, and submarines. Last thing I'll give you is a historical concept that we talked about. From 1941 to 1944, our nation built 8,800 ships, capital ships. In there were over 6 different kinds of destroyers, from escort destroyers to the main destroyers. There were 7 different classes of cruisers, 3 different battleships, and we had 5 different kinds of aircraft carriers. We ended the war with 72 aircraft carriers. Why? To deliver ordnance to where it needed to go. So the swarms that are expected with drones, frankly, in my mind, is no different than the kamikazes that we faced in the Pacific. The sheer numbers of them, and then the artillery that was put up forward was because of the large numbers of ships that we had available for anti-aircraft artillery. Not to mention the submarines, which frankly sank half of all the enemy tonnage combined at great loss to their own personnel. So wars are all one of attrition, and attrition drives change out of necessity for survival. I, for one, believe, with just the folks here at the panel and the leadership that's here and what's going on in the Department of Navy and the Department of War, from that standpoint, have what it takes to bring about that change in an industry capable of doing it. And they're willing to have the courage and make the bets.
Thank you. There's a lot of change going on right now. You saw the speech this morning, Secretary Hegseth, you're seeing these memos, you're seeing, I certainly, the Unmanned Task Force, when we set it up, it was a charge from CNO Gilday and Vice Chief Lesher of trying to figure out how do we go innovate. That was really the point of the Unmanned Task Force. Like, why can we not deliver inside 2027? Why can't we get out of our own way? Having said that, there's new leaders that are coming into the department. There's a lot of change going on. What would you say if they were sitting right here, the staffs in OSD, the Department of the Navy, the staffs in Congress? What would you want them to know? I'll just go right down the list. What would be your wish list of, hey, look, if you want to go fast, if you want to go 2027, here's the things you want to go do?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think a lot of the conversation right now, it doesn't matter what article you read, there's a lot on acquisition reform and the acquisition side of things. I think what I would say is the acquisition side of things is really important, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. And so we've got to look at it from a holistic approach. And so if you have JSIDS reform or acquisition reform, you still have to make sure that your end goal is the same, which is to field combat-ready capability and deploy it and use it in a wartime environment to help you with the fight. And so to do that, we have to make sure we start with a relevant operational problem. Because if we just start fielding things or have a tech push and we don't have a fleet pull, we're going to lose a lot of the momentum that we've gained. Right? So we have to start with a relevant operational problem, work through what the limiting factors are of that problem, figure out some of the solutions that can help meet that problem, figure out a way to scale it, answer those questions of, is it technically feasible that this thing can do the job? Is there warfighting utility there? And the last one I'm going to say, is there a path to scale there, right? And Michael's looking at me with a little bit of pride because that was our model with the DCO and the Unmanned Task Force. And so I don't think it matters what you call it, but I think you have to still do those things. And you have to look at the larger picture of the full DOT-MIL PF spectrum, not just the M. And you have to figure out the CONOPS and the TTPs and work with the fleet because as I've gone and helped NAVSER 4 and others with their CONOPS working groups and things, the things that they're worried about is not the same things that the people in the Pentagon are worried about. They're more worried about the facilities and the logistics and how to make all this stuff actually work. And so as long as we have that clear vision of, in the end of the day, you need to provide and field combat-ready capability that's ready to be deployed and used in a war, not just buy the systems and then hope you're going to push it to them and they're going to like it. So that would be the message that I share. Thank you.
Cool. To build on some of the conversation this afternoon, in some domains, not all domains, we should embrace disruption and risk. So we should embrace risk when we're building submarines. But when it comes to unmanned, we should embrace risk. And what does that mean? I think we talked about today, there's financial risk. Not everything you buy is going to work out. There's product risk. Sometimes products will work as designed, sometimes there's not. And then there's career risk. And the last one I kind of want to expand on a little, that I think in some areas, if you embrace risk and something fails within sort of the Navy culture, that isn't necessarily the thing that's going to lead to promotion. But we should reward the people who seek risk and who try things that don't work. And that should be a culture in some domains where people then get promoted. And sometimes failure is the fastest way to learn. And I think that's just something we're not seeing enough of today.
Admiral?
There's a lot of talk in the department these days about standards. I think we ought to think about standards for innovation, recognizing that pace of innovation is a strategic capability in and of itself, as the Ukrainians and the Israelis have proven to us. So in my company, we have one standard, which is you got to go from the whiteboard to the water in 6 months. It might not be pretty. It has to be a minimum viable prototype in a year. It has to be something that can work in a fleet situation in 2 years, and then something ready for mass production somewhat after that, folding in the lessons learned of all the previous steps. But if we don't make delivering something at pace part of the tasking for innovators and suppliers, then we get wrapped up in these bureaucratic functions as to what's the best way to organize. Do we have to have the CONOPS done before we have the product done? We don't. And so we need to provide new ways for our sailors and Marines to do things at pace and let them figure out the details of how to employ it.
I'm just going to do an audible, because I 100% agree with you. The question I would have is, who's holding the clock, right? Because I'm thinking if you're at the deck plate level, you're trying to go fast, but you're being impeded by oversight. So how do you break through all those barriers so you can move at pace?
I think leaders can do that. When I was the head of the submarine force, we had this thing we call the Undersea Rapid Capabilities Initiative. And for a product to be considered, it had to get wet in 2 years. Or for an idea to get considered, the idea had to get wet in 2 years. And we farmed some out to government labs. We found some out to academic institutions and so forth. And ironically, in this case, the academic institutions who didn't feel constrained by all those self-imposed constraints that people in government put on themselves all the time, they produced the fastest, they produced the best, and they produced the cheapest.
I don't know if you've heard of your Elon Musk idiot index of, tell me why that requirement is there, and if you can't tell me if it's not going to kill somebody, get rid of it, but totally agree.
He also has the one about if it doesn't defy the laws of physics, it's just engineering.
Totally agree. Rome?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a ruthless focus on these key operational problems, and kind of back to what John had mentioned. But we've got to remove some obstacles for that. I know from an industry standpoint, from an operator standpoint, you get access to a lot of KOPs. I did that with Admiral Munch when I was at N3 and 5. And then when I got into industry, all of a sudden I wasn't authorized to look at any KOPs. And so I think that access for industry needs to, and Admiral Swift did a really good job, I thought, when he was packed fleet, of bringing industry in and talking through KOPs. Now, I know that's been for example, at Indo-PACOM, they've done that, but I think it needs to be more consistent so that we can understand that we don't bring product to you that is not, or to the warfighter that's not needed, right? If we understand the problem, then we bring products that fit that gap, right? I think there's some underlying wartime resiliency pieces. And we had this conversation at Saab where when we talk about supply chains and we talk about those things, the urgency, a lot of that right now is from a peacetime perspective. But I'll give you an example. One of the things that struck me talking to some folks in the Department of the Navy were how long it takes to get something on contract. And when we talked about a particular capability, they said, "Oh, well, that takes 18 months to deliver that capability." And I said, "Wow, 18 months? Okay, that seems kind of quick." And he says, 10 months of that is contracting. And I was like, "Wow." And so the contracting piece, I think that would not only just benefit the warfighters, but would benefit industry, is figuring out how to streamline that better. And I know with the reform, with JSIDs and those sort of things, but I'm talking more at the level of, can you get a contract out using AI or some other sort of tools that streamline the workflows? Because when war comes, we're talking about peacetime and it's taking 18 months. When war comes and you talk about the Ukrainians and who else we could be fighting, you're talking about capability that has to get out there quick, and don't let the paperwork and stovepipes prevent you from fighting China or some other adversary. And so I think that those the use of OTAs, and doing 90-day sprints. We did that at SCAPA where, 90-day sprints, we got 6 different folks on contract to do that. And if you're not the best of breed, you're out. And if you are, then you have 12 months if you don't end up increasing your capability. So I think the OTAs help, enable that.
Okay. Greg?
I would say prepare for war. Prepare to win, to prevent war, and to preserve peace. Everyone needs to be on a wartime footing. It's as simple as that. That focuses your mind and lets you understand that processes that don't lead to productivity have no business anymore. So cut out those and delete those processes, accelerate the cycle time, and optimize the design afterwards. All these problems have to be bound in cost and time. Our timeline at Force Transformation in my business was 6 months. If that product was not leading to being sold within 6 months, I had no investors at the time. The liquidity wasn't there in the market, Everything that we got to eat, we killed ourselves from that standpoint, and we provided the means with which to do it. The other criteria I had is the CEO, myself, had to be able to assemble these complex electronic systems in 30 minutes or less. That drives the design so that those things could be done more affordably. So to reinforce it again, this nation needs to be on a wartime footing to recognize and understand the change that needs to come. The Chinese are building at a forensic rate. Why? Why are they doing it? Why did they just build 15 combat ships, 7 destroyers and 6 frigates and 1 amphib in 12 months? Because it's cool to have a gray ship on the water so you can beat your chest? I don't want to predict what China's going to be, but we have to be on a wartime footing, and I know that the Department of War is getting it there, so the culture has to be such that get on board, there's an opportunity to retire if you don't want to be part of that team, or move out of the way. And therefore, we're ready to go and make the change that are needed. The technology is there, the funding is available, and it takes just the means and the courage of leadership to make the decisions in a short period of time so that new entrepreneurs like Mike and Rylan and others can really bring their product to the market from that standpoint.
Perfect. We're now going to switch to audience questions, and so you see that there are microphones. So start thinking about your questions, and while you're thinking about that, we're going to switch to Jim Halsell, who is the Navy's Federal Executive Fellow, who's been taking questions from the web.
Thanks, Michael. And I would encourage our online audience, we are still taking questions online via the website link. Now, as you recall, when you registered, we solicited for questions you'd like to ask the panel. What we've done in advance is look at some of those questions and try and thematically combine those down to 2 to 3 questions that we can offer the panel today. So from those set of questions, question 1 is, with naval shipyard capacity already stretched thin, how will the Navy manage the maintenance and sustainment of unmanned vessels? Will this be absorbed by public yards, shifted to private industry, or approached in an entirely new way to avoid overburdening the fleet's existing maintenance infrastructure?
Yeah, I can jump in. So the President signed the Maritime Executive Order, Maritime Dominance Executive Order on April 9th. He has laid out the timeline, and I think October 6th is the next delivery that combines Treasury, Commerce, and the Department of War together to bring their resource to bear for not just the military shipyards, but commercial shipyards. They've also brought in other instruments from the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is opportunity zones, which is allowing for the funding and the decrease of taxation on those investments, along with South Korea, Japan, and Scandinavian countries. Right now, I know that Saab, by themselves, have already invested $200 million into our maritime industrial base, in the expansion of it, and we're seeing that writ large. So the environment is there, the tariff structures are there that the President has provided leadership for, and I have no doubt within just the matter of the next few months, we're going to see a great acceleration and resurgence of shipbuilding, not just in the existing public yards, but all the commercial yards with our allies and friends and the investments that have been made right now. So stand by, because I see that growth happening right now, and everyone's jumping aboard with all the money. There's almost $4 trillion of untapped capital that's ready to deploy with the leadership that's being provided by both the Navy and the Department of War.
Yeah, and if I could just add, in unmanned, there's sort of 2 categories. There's small and there's medium. Small can be made anywhere. They can be put on trailers, they can be put in trucks, they can be put on trains. Medium generally are 100 to 200 feet. We actually have a lot of capacity at these mid-tier yards. They're on all the coast. They build ferries, tugs, barges today. They're steel and aluminum. So we actually have a lot of capacity. I've visited these yards myself in person, whereas you're not going to build these medium-sized unmanned surface vessels at the large Navy yards. They're not being built at Bath Iron Works. They're not being built at GD NASCO or at Ingalls. So we have untapped capacity today to go build these unmanned vessels.
We do a lot of work with those smaller yards that build vessels up to about 300 feet. There is a lot of untapped capacity there. And the key for the Navy will be to tap that resource without overdriving the requirements in a way that makes them not want to do business with us. They're used to working with high-level specifications, performance specifications. They use equipment that is proven in the field to be reliable, but they're not used to dealing with military specifications and will be very hesitant to do business that focuses on that way of applying standards.
We'll move on to the next question from the group. Some would argue that we are overlearning the lessons of Ukraine, placing too much emphasis on unmanned systems, for example. For those who suggest that this signals the end of the carrier and the large surface ship, how would you respond to that idea?
When I first came into my A6 squadron as a young JO, we were still doing wagon wheel roll-ins from World War II. And I thought, this is nuts. Why are we doing that? And then we said we were going to avoid all the radars and fly down below 200 feet in the mountains at night. Well, certainly the first night of Desert Storm, my wingman was shot down and killed. My roommate was shot down, held prisoner of war. The next night, my wingman was shot down. One was held prisoner of war. The one was rescued. From that standpoint, we went from low altitude drops to high altitude in 24 hours. So we can adapt and learn. The lessons from Ukraine are lessons, okay? The next war, whatever it is, and the engagements, it's going to be different. But there's going to be certainly elements that are the same, but it will change in a matter of 24 to 72 hours on first engagement. Who's losing and what are you winning with? Again, all wars are one of attrition. So those engagements and the lethality of the systems that we have today, from ship-to-ship missiles that exist, and also from air-to-ship missiles and submarine-to-ship missiles, are devastatingly effective. So I think that their warfare, when we can predict the future, if we could, well, then we'd invest in only the thing that's going to matter. But the fallacy is we can't. Nor should we just rely on one single event in the past. Those lessons are known. One of them is small, fast, and many is devastating. That's almost been always immutable. Attrition will win out. Who has then the most left or the most destroyed will either win or lose.
I think one of the things, and I see an old shipmate out in the crowd, Mike Wheeldryer. I bring this up because we did an exercise and then certainly some operations where we were sending a destroyer out to go do reconnaissance. You know, I have the carrier, I need to go sense what's out there because I can't see past, and I'm trying to remain MCON. And I think when you look at the USV fleet and the hybrid fleet and what it can do, and you look at a China scenario, for example, or a Pacific scenario, you're talking about space, there's a ton of distance. Ukraine, a lot different. You're confined in there. I think the Russians showed very quickly that you can't leave. You can't get out there unless you go and sense ahead of time. But out in the Pacific, I think that, you know, if or when that occurs, you're going to need ISR, you're going to need ASW screening, you know, you're going to need, you know, some deception MCON. And how do you do that when you're trying to keep all your destroyers, you know, out of or within a weapons engagement zone survivable, right? They're going to have resilient comms and have those USVs and UUVs and UAVs out there sensing, something with AEW pods, right? That's something that Saab is working right now with unmanned UAVs. You can't go put an E3 or an E7 in a weapons engagement zone. So how are you going to open up lanes? Because the submarines are going to be busy, carriers are going to be quiet until they can get out, and yet those destroyers are going to have to go and find lanes or other areas in order to go and do their business. And I think that's where the complement of USVs from an operational standpoint are going to come in and really help sense in front of us those threats and create those ships to be decision engines, basically, like a C2 node versus just its own platform.
I'll just pile on a little bit because it's not either or. It's remote and autonomous in support of legacy in many cases or in addition to legacy in many cases. But if you look at the time frame that we're looking at right now for when the next crisis might happen, no matter what you do to improve the production of the legacy assets, very little will change in the time required. Whereas the things produced by most of the people here have the ability to scale during that time.
I just want to touch on that, Mike. So maybe folks don't realize that our capacity in World War II to get to the rate that we were started 2 years prior with Lend-Lease. We were giving all that armament equipment to Britain and our allies, so we were ramping up production and getting everybody together that way. And I think that's why I say that we're on a war footing right now. We need to start now. Look what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan when we ramped up production of our medium reconnaissance ambush protected vehicles. You know, those vehicles, we produced, I think, 18,000 of them for $27 billion, when the Army couldn't really yet produce the vehicle that then became Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. So we started and produced, I think, 5 different classes of armored trucks to protect our soldiers, and did it very quickly. Actually, it was through the Marine Corps that did it for the Acquisition Authority on behalf of the Army.
Yeah, let me just make one comment. I agree with Vice Admiral Connor. Part of the thing that we were doing, and if you're curious like why the Unmanned Task Force and DCO suddenly was messing around with little things, it was really meant to deliver a speed bump, because I agree with the Admiral, is that even if you drop $1 trillion in the U.S. Navy, you weren't going to double the size of the fleet of legacy assets. And so what speed bumps could you throw in Xi Jinping's way in terms of, he had 10 shipyards to our 2, we were sort of trying to spin up. And so, you know, we were tasked to change the decision calculus for Xi Jinping, or he's not as confident of what's going on now. Perversely, thankfully, he saw that play out with the Ukrainians, taking out the Russians asymmetrically. So speed was a huge component of it. So anyway, I'll shut up. And any more questions?
The audience questions.
So, sir, so if you're going to do a question, could you tell us who you are and where you're coming from?
Can you hear me? I'm Lieutenant Commander Torres. I'm a permanent military instructor here at the United States Naval Academy. I recognize from my days at Surf Devon 1. But my comment goes to the Warfare Center and research teaming, right? And what I would like to point out is that, you know, we take it for granted. We talk Ukraine. Nobody is talking about what Russia is doing. Nobody. I never hear it, right? We put up a slide there that had everything that Ukraine was. Where's the slide for all the drones that Russia is innovating? And they're innovating a lot, and we are ignoring that. But what I want to get to is that they have a unit called Rubicon Unit, right? And Rubicon Unit is something where they do exactly what we were talking, where we have the teaming between Warfare Center and research and development laboratories within Russia. And the military personnel of that unit are not just executing experimentation procedures. They're not just operators. They are innovating along with the civilian researchers and engineers in Russia. And so my argument is that we need to do something like that here. We have lots of people in uniform like myself who have masters and doctorates in technical fields which are underutilized. You get your master in a technical field or a doctorate in a technical field, well, you've checked the box. That means you continue with your career. You might as well get a master's in underwater basket weaving. So that kind of, and that would accelerate research and development. It would achieve the teaming, and it gets to that continuous experimentation as well, where there's a collaboration of continuous experimentation on a continual basis. And then just wanted to thank you, sir, for bringing up the concept that we need to be on a war-fighting footing. I never hear that, ever, and it's my infinite frustration and disgust that I don't hear it amongst my peers. So I'm glad that, you know, I hear it. We need that more, much more.
Now, do you have a comment? I'm just looking at the time. Do you have an actual
Yeah,
question?
so my comment is, could we speak to what is the feasibility of doing a collaboration like that between active duty military as researchers along with civilian or in the government research and development labs? Is that a possibility? Can it be done, et cetera? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take that. I think absolutely can be done. The NSW community seems to do that better than the surface Navy community. And there are examples of that. Most of them we can't really speak to in a public forum, but I think the biggest difference I see is they can bring everyone together in the same location, have those researchers and warfighters together and get on the water over and over and over again. As you may remember, some of the times when we worked together, it was preparing for the next big exercise, right? And if you're always preparing for the next integrated battle problem and you've got a year-long planning cycle, it's not getting you the reps and sets needed to move fast, and you're focused on showing up for the exercise and not necessarily the advancing the capability on a day in, day out, everyday basis. And so I think it's just a cultural shift as you shift from surface warfare, thinking of SWAT events quarterly or large events, to how do we get on the water every day with a small USV or a medium USV and get out there much more often and bring the technologist and the warfighter together. And some of those may be the same person, to your point. So I completely agree. I think that would be a target to shoot on.
And John, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, you're doing that quite extensively with the Stiletto. It's done between 300 and 400 technical experiments on that vessel over the last 10 years. About 30% of that have made it into the fleet in some form. I mean, most recently they brought in an Israeli company that's a startup to do autonomous retrieval of an 11-meter rib. Remarkable. And it's only on that platform that they're experimenting and have at-sea opportunities that then flow into the naval series. I mean, am I correct?
Yeah, you're exactly correct. And I think one of the downsides of the warfare centers is they're not a company for profit, right? So we're not really good at marketing. So there's a lot of things that are happening, and unless there's a company that kind of touts that experience, then a lot of times it doesn't get out to everyone. And so that warfare center role is really bridging. It should serve a function. It should be complementary and serve a function from the industry solution to the warfighter, and how can it bridge that gap? And if we're doing it right, that's what we should be doing as warfare centers. So I completely agree. Thanks for asking the question.
Hi, Sam Legrand with USNI News. Can you gentlemen talk a little bit more about some of the larger USVs like MASC? I mean, LUSV, MUSV, I mean, that was pretty undefined, pretty unfunded. Now moving forward, there looks to be opportunities for competitions for software, competitions for the platform, competitions for payload. How are you all understanding how those kind of requirements are being communicated to industry, and what's the output supposed to look like on the other end?
Sure. So the Navy held an industry day for MASC, which I think is an evolution from MUSV. And I think if you go back to the summer of 2024, there's a lot of focus on LUSV, but that all got collapsed into MASC. And so they had an industry day. There are 3 different types of vessels that they're looking for. Some are higher speed, some are higher capacity. And I expect them to make decisions pretty quickly and to have multiple companies building prototypes to be launched next year. And so I see a lot of momentum in that program. I think there's interest from traditional industry and non-traditional industry, and I think you'll see things in the water operating next year.
I would say it's not moving fast enough. This started in 2016 with the Sea Hunter, right, that DARPA funded. And so there shouldn't be almost a limit on the number of companies that are brought in to build and the material that's chosen, from steel, aluminum to composites, to try out all of those things and squeeze down the timeline as fast as possible in order to deliver it, with the promissory that you're going to build 50 to 100 vessels of each of those types. We've got to explore and experiment as many of those as, and that will help boost the industry as well.
That really gets to my point earlier of we need the fleet pull. So when you look back in 2016, I think the reason why there wasn't as much momentum is it was more of a tech push than a fleet pull of what operational problem were you solving. So I think there was a generalized approach of what they wanted to do with Sea Hunter, and it was ambitious of what they wanted to do, and I don't remember the classification, but point being is that I think it was more of a tech industry looking at a way to solve what they thought was the problem. As long as we're aligning to, and this is to your point, Rome, it's hard for industry to know what to solve if you don't know the key operational problems. And so I think that's where we need to make sure that we're somehow translating or communicating that. And if you look at some of the area of interest statements that these CSOs now put out, there's a lot of work that goes into trying to take a classified topic and make it unclassified. I've been in those working groups and we're trying to say, no, you can't say that. You use this word instead of that word. And it's not always easy, but if we can keep aligning to an operational problem, then that fleet pull will continue and the momentum will continue. If we start throwing stuff over the fence and hoping they like it, that's probably when we'll lose the momentum and it'll turn back into 2016.
Totally agree. So I'm going to, I've got, 3 more questions. So what I would suggest, because we've got about 3 minutes maybe, if somebody asks a question, if you think you're best in show, if you got the world's greatest question, feel free to answer, feel free to answer it. As opposed to, don't feel like we have to fill. We're just trying to get these guys in. So with that.
Sure. Commander Patrick Sullivan, I left about a week and a half ago from Kyiv as the U.S. Naval Attaché in Ukraine. I wanted to talk, Ukraine has the, it's certainly not a blessing, but no capital ships really underway at any given time. And so really it's a strictly unmanned systems question. But we're talking about the combination of legacy systems and unmanned systems. And I wonder what sort of redesign or innovation will need to be done on the legacy systems to make sure that they're interoperable with in unmanned systems at scale, so that ultimately you can deliver the effects that you would want, maybe ostensibly in the Western Pacific.
I'll be
Thank
glib. I mean, the United States Navy has tens of thousands of drones. They're called missiles. They're just drones that don't come home. We've had them, and we have them with a great command and control system and leadership and command authority to exercise those things. Ukraine didn't have and doesn't have any of those things, so they're relying on what they can make and what they can afford and what they can have in resource and reach. But from Tomahawks to the SM-2s, the SM-6s, and everything out there, it's a remarkable fleet and capability. Just, we need a lot more of them.
I'll add to that just a little bit, is that it's not as hard as you think. We take systems and we deliver data to NOAA, Coast Guard, Navy, and about 4 different commercial customers, each of which has their own version of the COP. But if you get your right geo-reference data, you can interface with a couple of smart software engineers talking to each other to anyone's product. So you don't have to solve world hunger before you start. You just have to start.
Great, thank you.
Welcome back, by the way, Pat.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Commander Charles Johnson, recently from NAVCENT Counter-UAS. And after just coming back from that and also having some experience in the Nav Air world, this question is for Dr. Phillips, but it's also open to everyone else. When we talk about, for example, counter unmanned systems and the different people that are in charge of it, just like we saw with DCO and some of the other RAS activities, there is such a division of labor and a repetition of effort. How do we overcome that? So for example, PMS 408 from NAVSEA Ukraine, they're going to be working on things like Drake and at sea counter UAS. We have Carter Rock, which is doing some of the unmanned systems for the water. We've got Dahlgren, which is doing lasers. We've got Nav Air, which is working on base counter UAS for CNIC. So lots of different stakeholders who aren't talking to each other. And when we move in the Navy Working Capital Fund model, where people are competing for that business and trying to take their slice of the pie and not necessarily talking to each other, how do we overcome that?
Yeah, so we've had similar challenges in the small USV world, and back in January, we held a USV community of practice summit to bring all those guys together. And we had, so now I run a monthly meeting called the USV community of practice, and we go through what everyone's doing and try to make sure that there's not too much duplication of effort. It's only an hour, but and we focus on it being a working session. So we maintain a USV summary of all of the projects happening across the enterprise, and we highlight areas of, hey, there's duplication here. I can't control all of the different sectors, but I would hope that a colleague from a Nav Air would stand up a similar type of practice that would be able to bridge that gap. Unfortunately, not to speak overly highly of myself, that was a kind of a heroics of me seeing a problem and trying to do it. No one tapped me to do it. You need a coalition of the willing to do that. And so we really need those leaders to step up throughout the naval research and development establishments to make sure we stop wasting money and wasting resources. Because I think right now, especially with the DRP cuts, we are all resource limited in people. I think people is actually worse than funding to try to get the jobs done. And so there's only a limited number of experts that can really dive into some of these things. And so we have to be careful not to duplicate efforts. I completely agree with you.
I'll just add one sentence really quickly. So that was really the structure we tried to set up. If you had all these different people, and in all these organizations is we try to say, that's the operational problem. All you guys come in and work together to solve that problem, not optimize your own little warfare center. So great question. And I think we've got the last question.
All right. Last time I asked a question was at a Forstall lecture. Mark Olson, owner of a 20-year-old service-disabled veteran-owned small business focusing on maritime operations, maintenance, training as well. When I look at this problem, I know we've talked about Ukraine and some of the lessons learned. I think there's also lessons learned when, we did a European phase adaptive approach, iteration, put the building blocks in the theater where they're going to operate. And so the two concerns that I have mainly are the sustainment piece, where a capability isn't realized unless you get it in the hands of the warfighter. They're deploying that on a daily basis to get their reps and sets. But then there's another challenge as USV RONs, UUV RONs stand up and start building that next generation of kind of practitioner in this new space. There's another challenge, and that is, as the integration is taking place, what are we putting out in theater and what foundation are we setting forth? So I see that as sort of that's almost like a deployment gap. That's just the practical realities. You're going to integrate this on an ARG? Well, the ARG's got space that is taken up with other things, and there are other claimancies and stakeholders. So I think that's what can be done like today to start doing, putting autonomy on vessels of opportunity and or getting facilities set up, either through a COCO model or what have you, because you're going to need a lot of forward deployed support in order to get that set up.
Good question. And I think we can follow some lessons that were learned in unmanned aviation, where people will bring a capability to theater, usually a private company, usually heavily manned or staffed, I should say, by people with prior military experience. And then they get paid when that UAV crosses the line, and now they're getting paid by the hour or whatever it is. But that's a good bridge, and that way a lot of people get to see what quality information comes out of it, what quality missions come out of it. If it's kinetic, you can hand the wheel over to active duty military people who are authorized to do things like that. And again, that's a way to have an interim solution to the problem without having to have the final solution before you build the thing.
The Rapid Equipping Force during Iraq and Afghanistan with the U.S. Army did this very well. They had a single colonel responsible for the unit, a $100 million budget that reported directly to their assistant chief of staff, and they created 9-line briefs with which those in the field can come up with their problems, deliver it to the Rapid Equipping Force, and then they would search industry to do that. That's how our company got its start and why we were so successful. We went through 5 different iterations of our electronic keel design in those vehicles, but I went on patrol with the 3rd ID and many other units against the will of our lawyers and our insurance companies to find out how they were using the system, and we kept iterating it. But the Rapid Equipping Force gave us the money for the systems, firm fixed price, and then provided sustainment funds so that we can come and support those soldiers both on installation and training and operations. And it was a very successful model. Larger armies started to hate that system because it obviously competed with larger programs of record. But that's a very successful model that we've used in wartime.
And I think that's it. And I'm a bad host because I think we're 6 minutes over, but we were worried we weren't getting enough questions. But I just want to say thank you to Admiral Spicer, to April, to Dawn, and Jim Halsell, and thank you to the panelists and all the questions.
I was gonna say I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is the panel's over, and it's a sign of a good panel when there's more questions and less time than we have to answer them all or to even ask the questions. But the good news is that we can continue the conversation because we have topside a reception where you can engage these speakers and panelists, and we can continue the conversation that way. So I want to thank Michael and the esteemed members of this panel. It was a great panel discussion. If I want to make a plug for something, if you're interested in events like this, We have another big event coming up, which is our annual history conference that we co-sponsor with the Naval Academy. It will be done here. It's a full-day conference. If you're interested, there's a QR code for you to go and zap right now. Otherwise, you can see it on our website, usni.org. We've got some amazing speakers lined up for that event, so it's going to be a great one. And then as a small token of our appreciation to all our panelists, we have a U.S. Naval Institute press book, Naval Power in Action by Brent Sadler, that each of our participants will receive. So thank you again, and we will see you all topside. So thank you very much.